Oh, happy days. I was born in Denby in 1939, the third son of Emma and Mivanwi Van Evans. My father was a baker by trade, but moved to work at Evan Jones and Son, Electrical and Wireless, in Highgate, where he was manager of the business for many years. My brothers are Granville and Mervyn, and my sister, Betty. My home throughout my young life was at number 2 Rose Villas, in Middle Lane, the middle house of a block of 3, almost exactly halfway down the lane. I will, therefore, try to recollect the residents and landmarks of that part of Denby some 60-odd years ago. Moving up the lane from my home, next door at number 1 Rose Villas lived my Auntie Meg and Uncle Ike Edwards, their daughter Nancy, and my Nane, Harriet Davis, Meg and Van's mother, and widow of John Willie Davis butcher. Ike was a bus driver with Crosville, and Meg, a real friendly, colourful character. I recall that she would organise trips to the Blackpool Illuminations, and to Pantasaf Monastery at Easter, etc., and I remember the excitement early on a Sunday morning, of seeing a Crosville bus making its way down Middle Lane, well off route, to pick us all up. I wonder if Crosville ever knew that one of their buses went missing for the day. Continuing up the lane, the next house was the home of Di Edward and Bessie Thomas, and their children Kathleen, Brenda, and Edgar. Uncle Di was an attendant at the North Wales Mental Hospital. Next door up were Mr. and Mrs. Davis, and children Lillian and Marcus. I remember Mr. Davis as quite an elderly gentleman, probably some 20 years younger than me now, who always smoked a heavy pipe, and was caretaker of the clinic across the road. He would grow all his flowers and vegetables in the gardens in front of, and behind the clinic all now, alas, car park. Their neighbours were Will Savage Jones and his wife, and daughter a good joiner. Next came the considerable expanse of the playing field of the county school, later the grammar school. It was on the school field in 1953 that we had our street party to mark the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. I also recall that, some years earlier, possibly during the war, the field was used for a display by, or competition between local fire brigades. The first house after the top entrance gates was that of a Mr. and Mrs. Jones, the retired caretaker and cook at the county school. Their neighbours were the then caretaker and his family, Mr. and Mrs. Pitt Williams, Gwyn, and Bryn. The major interest of the boys of the lane at that time was, of course, playing football, and it was Gwyn who excelled over all of us by going on to play for Wales at amateur level in later life. A school teacher and her husband lived next to them, a Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and I have the memory of a young boy in particularly recalling that Mr. Jones had a large BSA motorbike and sidecar. Another young boy who was to do well in later life, becoming a burgess of the town, mayor, county councillor, football referee, and long-serving secretary of the Denby Flower Show, Emrys Williams, and his parents, brothers and sisters, lived in the next house. Now, we reach the top of the lane. Number 3, up at a short flight of steps, was occupied by a family named Clayton. Number 1 was part of the corner building adjoining Post Office Lane, an original corner shop. As a youngster, this was always known to me as Peter's shop, Mr. and Mrs. Peters, and later became the shop of Mr. and Mrs. Trevor Jones, who lived in Grove Road. Around the corner lived the Hooks family, and their neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Royals, a window cleaner, and their son Roy, who was in school with me. On the opposite side of Post Office Lane lived a Miss Nellie Jones again, one of my teachers at Vronor, and adjacent to her house was the entrance to Wyberlin Farm, but I was not allowed to wander any further into that area. To return now down the opposite side of Middle Lane, my recollections of the first 2 cottages are really from my later life, when they were occupied by Danny Jones, who worked in the body shop of Smithfield Garage, and his family, and next door, Phil and Nancy, my cousin, Pendlebury, and daughters Diane and Christine. Then came a run of high stone walls and outbuildings which were, in effect, the rear perimeter of the gardens of Mr. T. Gwilym Davis, dental surgeon, at Lyndhurst in Vale Street. I was a childhood friend of Mr. and Mrs. Davis's, John. At the ages of 9 or 10, we contributed a great deal, or so we thought, towards the building work to create what is now Grovehurst in Middle Lane. This house was subsequently occupied by a Mr. and Mrs. Dickens and their daughter. Mr. Dickens remains prominent in my memory as he, in due course, became manager of our football team, Dendy Juniors, under 16, and I feel was quite inspirational in leading us to a number of successes in the youth football of the area at that time. Later, the property was the home of a Mr. Chadwell and his family, an assistant dentist with Mr. Davis. Behind the high stone wall on the upside of Grovehurst was built Lees, which became the home Sir Francis Williams, QC. Returning to the downhill journey, we now reach Lon Cobner or Dr. Lloyd's Lane, as it was always known to us. The walled grounds running the full length of the right-hand side were, again, the gardens of substantial townhouses in Vale Street, principally Whitehall. In later years these would become progressively built upon, to become the individual homes of Emmeline and Christine Jones, Tom and Vida Kelly, Idris and Hannah Lloyd, Mr. Wyn Rogers, and their respective families. The large property on the corner of Vale Street seems to have been, for as long as I can remember, the county headquarters of the Women's Institute. Facing this building on the opposite side of Dr. Lloyd's Lane is the Beach House Doctor's Surgery. I recall a Dr. Duff setting my broken arm there, at the age of about 7 or 8, after I had fallen off the roundabout in the wreck. Then comes the old coach house belonging to Beach House, where TOCH held their meetings in the upstairs room, and my father garaged his first car down below, an Austin A30, the Bluebird for the family. Next door was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Boycott and their children, Margaret and Colin. Mr. Boycott ran a busy plumbing business. From their garden there was a side door leading directly into Middle Lane, and as children we used this, from time to time, mainly to retrieve footballs lofted over the quite high stone wall. The housing on this side of Middle Lane finished here, but then there was and still is the clinic. I am sure I must be imagining it, but I sense that I remember being weighed in that silver-panned baby scale, under the watchful eye of Nurse Evans. I certainly do remember, however, lining up with my fellow pupils from Vronghawk outside the surgery of Mr. Fussell, the dreaded school dentist. Who could forget? To continue down the lane from Rose Villas at number 3 lived our very good neighbours George and Dorothy Roberts, he, a dental mechanic with Mr. Gwilym Davis, and their children, Geoffrey and Michael. Then came a terrace of 4 cottages, the first, number 31 Middle Lane, formerly occupied by Mrs. Powell, subsequently became the first home of Joan and I and our son Paul. Next door at number 33 lived relatives of mine, Peter and Esther Roberts. He was an engine driver on the railway, LMS, and I have happy memories of occasional rides on the footplate of shunting engines, steam of course, with Uncle Peter. Their neighbours at number 35 were Mr. and Mrs. Alec Jones and their daughter Anne. Mr. Jones was, for many years, the caretaker of the Denby Liberal Club on High Street. In the last house of the terrace, number 37, lived Mr. Di Jones and his wife May. Mr. Jones also was a railwayman. At Kenda, next door, lived Mr. and Mrs. Harry Ellis. I believe that Mr. Ellis was manager at the gasworks on Rill Road, but seemed to be far more well known for his prowess in winning, year after year, the major trophies for the large flower displays at the Denby, and other local flower shows. The last house in the lane Roft was that of my uncle and aunt, Bill, W.O., and Evelyn Jones, and their son Gwyn. W.O. was the proprietor of Evan Jones and Son, and I remember on one Sunday morning being crowded into the highest, and smallest, room in the shop building in Love Lane, together with numerous relatives, to witness the first television pictures to be transmitted. To Denby, a black and white test card as I recall. I also have a vague memory of the 2 schoolgirl evacuees from Guernsey whom my uncle and aunt took in during the war. The Roft Garden extends as far as the junction with Grove Road, Red Lane, where, directly opposite, the high street fruit and vegetable merchant, Solly Hyman, had his transport yard and garages. Many a test match and cup final were played on that extremely cobbled yard. On the upside of the yard lived Mrs. Batten Jones, and her children, Hayden, Margaret, and Anne. Their immediate neighbors were Mr. and Mrs. Di Davis, proprietors of Owens and Davis, grocers and sub-post office in Townsend. Set back from Grove Road somewhat, at Bodowan, lived Emlyn and Hilda Jones and their 4 sons, and close friends of mine, Alwyn, Urin, Berwin, and Selwyn. Mr. Jones was employed at the timber yard at the bottom end of Grove Road. I have only a vague memory of a young man named Iolo living in the adjoining house. The first house of the neighboring terrace was the home of another Emlyn, and Mrs. Jones, and their children Beryl and Neville. Mr. Jones also was an attendant at the North Wales Hospital. Again, facing the junction with Middle Lane, was the home of the proprietors of the timber yard, a Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd. Their neighbors were Police Sergeant Richards, his wife and children, Bobby, Betty and Patrick, also good school friends of mine. I cannot recall the names of their immediate neighbors, but next door again lived a Mr. and Mrs. Williams and their son Ernest, another school friend, and who went on to work with the then LMS. Their neighbor at Bronberlin was Ernest's Auntie Katie. I know no more. The end house of this row was occupied by Mr. Morris. Inspector. An inspector of what, I don't know. I think, possibly that he was an employee of the water board. A Mr. and Mrs. Davis lived next door at Bryn Trevor. The last house at this extreme of my patch was the bungalow of Mr. Jack Roberts, whose garden reached down as far as the stream in Kyfrom, and always appeared to me to be a mass of greenhouses and flowers. Adjoining this garden were a number of public allotments, at one of which I spent many a happy hour helping my father to grow his vegetables. Whilst, in those early post-war years, it was extremely necessary to try to provide vegetables from the garden plot for the family table, and Dad was, in fact, almost self-sufficient in this way, he did also win many prizes for his veg at local flower and produce shows. On the lower side of Grove Road, beyond Hyman's yard, is a terrace of 7 houses. I recall only the occupants of the first and last. At number 33 lived Mr. George Griffiths, employed at the North Wales Hospital, his wife, aunt and son Robert, another school friend of mine. At the other end of the terrace lived a Mr. and Mrs. Williams and their son Raymond. I believe he was a painter, whilst she was a nurse at the Denby Infirmary. Adjoining this end house was the timber yard, a thriving and bustling sawmill, with timber arriving and departing both by road and rail. Also travelling in the same manner were cattle and sheep, from the railway pens alongside. I can remember them being herded along the road, down Vale Street and under the railway bridge, and away along Rowlorrithin Road. The goods yard and the railway station were at this end of my patch, and what wonderful buildings these were now, unfortunately, lost forever. At the bottom corner of Grove Road is Lismethig, the former home of the internationally famous harpist, Osian Ellis. Next to this property was the Memorial Hall, now Theatre TWM or Nantes, which, for a period during the war, became a temporary barracks for American soldiers, GIs. I can remember, as a cheeky toddler, waiting outside the hall and asking them as they emerged, "Have you got any gum, chum?" The fantastic response almost every time was to be thrown several packets of chewing gum, and popcorn, etc. We thought we were in heaven. A few years later, after the war, a little chip shop opened at the corner of Grove Road and Vale Street, Mickey's Cafe. Around the corner from the cafe, into Vale Street, was the final building on my tour, Salisbury Place, already derelict at that time. Nowadays, the site of the Lidl's store, and before that, both a manufacturing business and a biscuit factory, Marsden's, it was originally the very substantial home of Dr. Evan Pierce. Its very large gardens stretched across behind the house as far as Middle Lane. The vast area of beech trees and derelict formal gardens was, of course, another wonderful playground for us. It is very pleasing to see that the gardens of the monument erected in memory of Dr. Pierce, across Vale Street from the house, are currently being extremely well renovated, with a view to shortly reopening to the public, after many years. I will return now to where we started, to Middle Lane. My early education had been at Roanoke Infants and then the junior school, both in Grove Road, and now used as the Magistrates' Courts. I then moved on to the grammar school in Middle Lane. Although I can recall most of my excellent teachers over the years, there is one who quite prominently stands out in my memory, not for his excellence, but for quite the reverse really. He was Mr. Clem Edwards, woodwork and metalwork. I clearly recall being taught at woodwork how to dig up worms from the school field, and at metalwork, how to make metal minnows, both bait for his passion in life, fishing. The school had few facilities, which nowadays would be expected, such as an assembly hall or gymnasium, and morning assembly/prayers were held in the adjoining chapel schoolroom Bodowan. Access to Bodowan was across the girls' yard and past the bike shed. Beyond Bodowan and into Post Office Lane was the school's unofficial tuck shop, Addy's. This was a small general grocer's and bread shop, but Mrs. Addy also sold sweets. The original property also incorporated a small commercial bakehouse and was, in fact, built for my wife's grandmother, Mrs. Alice Evans, wife of Reverend John Howell Evans, who ran it for many years, including a small cafe upstairs, as a family business. In conclusion, I know I now see my young life in and around Middle Lane through rather rose-colored glasses. The war started the year I was born, and in reality, life was very hard for everyone throughout, and well beyond, the war years. However, it is wonderful to be able to recollect also, so much happiness with my family and friends, mostly based on self-motivated play and sport. 2 sets of coats thrown down in the middle of the lane, and we had a Wembley football pitch. And the match finished only when the town gas lamp lighter arrived to light the street lamp on the corner of Dr. Lloyd's Lane. It was then bedtime. Oh, happy days. By Bryn Evans.